Hello and welcome to the AIB Journals webinars, where we feature the latest research from our two journals, the Journal of International Business Studies and the Journal of International Business Policy. Today we have a very special session because we are celebrating the Decades Award winner for last year. The Decade Award is, well, what I consider the most prestigious award in our community. It's given to a paper that has stood the test of time and has been recognized in the field and has been picked up by other scholars, influenced further lines of research. And the winner, as all of you probably know, is David Teece's paper on dynamic capabilities in the multinational enterprise and how this theoretical construct helps us gaining more insights on how the multinational enterprises work. Just as a background on this series, most of you know we have been running this series since approximately May 2020, and we usually invite scholars who recently published their original work, mixing junior and senior perspectives on common themes running through our work. We try to involve a variety of different perspectives. Today, in addition to David, we have two other senior scholars who reflect over David's work, and all those papers are published in JIBS. And I've just received the message yesterday that the issue number 1, 2025 is out, and that new issue contains the 3 reflection papers that are the subject of today. You can actively participate in the conversation. We will be using the Q&A function to collect questions. And my co-host, Liena Kano, will pick questions from the questions you ask in the Q&A. You can also vote on questions, by the way, in the Q&A, and that means Liena will get them, get the attention to those questions. Liena is a professor of international business at University of Calgary. She has published extensively on international business, especially thinking about the theory of the multinational enterprise, perhaps with a little bit of a different starting point than David's work. Also, she's expert on family business and on global value chains. Liena is joining us from Calgary today, and she will lead us to the conversation. Liena, over to you.
Thank you very much, Klaus. So welcome, everybody. As Klaus mentioned, today's selection of papers comes from the first issue of JIBS, and it's a collection of reflections on David Teece's path-breaking paper that was published 10 years ago. And I think that paper is very important for IB scholars for 2 reasons mainly. First, it promoted and popularized a notion that international expansion is in itself an act of entrepreneurship and should be treated as such by management scholars. And second, it highlighted the complementarity of the capabilities-based perspectives and classic efficiency-based IB theory, namely transaction cost and internalization theories. And I would say that this complementarity is particularly important today because it can help us paint an integrative picture of the challenges that are facing M&Es in the increasingly geopolitically, socially, technologically complex environment. So here, dynamic capabilities gives detailed insights into the features of capabilities that are needed to achieve a fit between the M&E and its multiple environments. And transaction cost theory helps predict how these capabilities can be accessed and organized for M&E to achieve international competitive success. So very important insights that stood the test of time. And we will start with the reflections that are offered by 2 eminent management scholars, and then we will invite David to offer his own reflections. Our first speaker today is Tamer Cavusgil, who's joining us from Michigan. Tamer is a chaired professor and executive director of the Center of International Business Education and Research at Georgia State University. He currently serves as the Dean of AIB Fellows. He's a recipient of multiple high-profile research and teaching awards that I don't have time to list. And he's best known for his research in global strategy, emerging market, international marketing, and born globals and born digitals. So Tamer, over to you.
Thank you so much, Liena. Thank you, Klaus, both of you, for organizing this series. It's a pleasure to be here with my distinguished colleagues, and I want to thank everybody who joined us today, a good number of people from around the world. I'd like to start out by offering some general observations and then talk about the paper that my good colleague Şeyda Deligönül and I have co-authored the commentary, which got published in the first issue, as our host mentioned. I will not go into detail of that paper. It's fairly brief, and I think hopefully people will be able to read it, review it, but perhaps go a little bit beyond that and talk a little bit about conditions under which dynamic capabilities framework proves to be very superior. And conversely, when DCV, dynamic capabilities framework or theory, may not work well. And then for colleagues out there who may be wondering, how do I choose? I think the question arises, there are all these theories, and in my research, do I, favor dynamic capabilities, or do I rely upon something like behavioral theory or TCE or RBV? So I'd like to offer some comments on that. And I know I won't get to that last bullet that I have in my notes here, given the limited time, but formalization of dynamic capabilities framework, how do we transition this framework or dynamic capabilities view into formalized theory in the sense that it incorporates some foundational propositions, logical, self-evident truths that define the conceptual core, as well as empirical propositions, testable real-world applications that validate and refine the theory. But let me start out with some general observations. The core idea, of course, behind the dynamic capabilities is about how organizations may integrate, build, and reconfigure competencies, whether they are internal or external. How do they go about reconfiguring in order to stay competitive in rapidly changing, fast-changing environments? The fundamental proposition is about competitiveness. And that's why I think the dynamic capabilities has found a very warm place among scholars and has been applied in so many different contexts. It does relate to how firms adjust and preserve superior performance. So any management theory that deals with firm and firm competitiveness is going to be looked at very, very favorably. And dynamic capabilities works best under certain conditions, markets that are uncertain, rapidly changing, and are complex, not when markets are static. And I'll give some examples of that. And of course, dynamic capabilities view or theory promotes adaptability, agility, innovation. That's another distinctive feature of David's work. The central concepts, of course, you may recall the micro foundations are about sensing and seizing opportunities and transforming the organization. The broad applicability of the dynamic capabilities framework relies upon its eclectic nature, the fact that it synthesizes ideas from behavioral theory, transaction cost economics, evolutionary theory, and RBV. So in our paper, brief paper, the commentary in the JIBS, my good colleague Şeyda Deligönül and I made some points and try to illustrate the relationship between DCV and these other theories. But we also called attention to Teece's work in terms of the ability to, given us the ability, the opportunity to reframe or rethink our conventional understanding of fundamental concepts, the firm, the market's competitive strategy as well. So in terms of markets, the dynamic capabilities implies a constructivist view of markets. And this is very important. The view where markets are not given, but are constructed through the actions and interactions of organizations with their environment. The firm can be viewed as the network orchestrator, especially multinationals function as network orchestrators. They orchestrate complex global networks of suppliers, partners, customers, and so on. The reframing of the firm is also very important in the sense that the nature and purpose of the firm with the dynamic capabilities view is continuously reconstructed through interactions and changing environments. So the firm has the ability to evolve, and the purpose of the firm is not just to survive, but to thrive through adaptation, through transformation, and through innovation. Teece's work also enables us to reframe strategy. With Teece's writings, we see that strategy is not a static plan, but it's an evolving process of interaction, learning, and reconfiguration, constantly influenced by evolving events. So especially in the context of the M&E, this strategic improvisation and strategic fluidity are very central, very important constructs. And of course, finally, the ability to reframe competitive advantage. Knowing how to change, David argues in his many writings, as well as in the Decade paper, knowing how to change the dynamic capabilities themselves are just as crucial as knowing how to compete, the operational capabilities. Learning mechanisms are critical in the dynamic capabilities view, and competitive advantage is always relative. Best practices adopted by firms in an industry do not necessarily ensure performance because they are easily copied, imitated by other firms in the same idea. So coming back to my another bullet point there, the situations where the dynamic capabilities work really well include many international business contexts or general management contexts. In foreign market entry, for example, the dynamic capabilities helps firms adapt to new cultures, navigate regulations, and build legitimacy. Under rapidly technological changes in industries like IT or biotech, where adaptation is key, again, DCV becomes very helpful. Market volatility and uncertainty enables businesses to pivot strategies effectively. And I can cite other conditions. It's a long list where the dynamic capabilities perspective really works well. And this of course explains why it has found a very warm place, popular place in management scholars, not just in international business, but other aspects of management as well. Global supply chains, strategic alliances, partnerships, digital transformation, policy changes, sustainability, crisis management, and so on. The common themes in these scenarios have to deal with adaptability, resource orchestration, managing complexity, crisis agility, sustainability focus, anticipation of disruption, collaboration, and learning. And these are all unique to the dynamic capabilities view that David has propounded. The conditions also under which dynamic capabilities may not work as well, therefore one may consider other types of other perspectives or theories. One would be an example of a stable or slow changing industry. Let's say utilities or cement or steel, where dynamic capabilities focus on adaptability, but in these industries, one does not need necessarily constant change. In these sectors, cost efficiency and operational excellence matter more than constant resource configuration, as well as in extreme uncertainty or nascent markets. Industries like AI, biotech, or quantum computing, there's too much uncertainty for traditional sensing mechanisms to work. In such cases, trial and error learning, something like effectuation theory, is more useful than dynamic capabilities. And perhaps dynamic capabilities places too much focus or faith on internal capabilities. It underestimates the power of networks. Not everything happens inside a company. Ecosystems like Amazon and Alibaba show that external partnerships can be just as critical as internal capabilities. In this context, network theory offers a better lens for businesses relying on alliances and collaborations. And under conditions of weak or complex institutions, DCV assumes companies can operate in any environment, but in places with corrupt or weak regulations, agility is useless if firms lack legitimacy. Example would be companies in emerging markets that need to prioritize building trust and legitimacy rather than constant reconfiguration. And institutional theory here may be a better fit in these circumstances. And those circumstances where these micro foundations may be hard to measure and test. Concepts like sensing, seizing, transforming are too broad and abstract. So there's no clear way to measure success or compare across industries. So without precise definitions, it's hard to tell whether firms are truly using dynamic capabilities or just reacting to market shifts. And then perhaps dynamic capabilities overestimates managerial abilities. To some extent, dynamic capabilities assumes managers can predict changes and make rational strategic moves. But in reality, managers suffer from biases, limited information, and decision-making inertia. Example would be Nokia that failed to see the smartphone revolution, not because of lack of capabilities, but due to confirmation bias and poor decision-making. So the behavioral theory here is a better perspective. And when you think about smaller firms, SMEs, again, that may not have the resources of a large firm, again, dynamic capabilities may be a little bit far-stretched. Short-term focus also can hurt long-term strategy. Dynamic capabilities emphasizes constant adaptation, but firms that pivot too often risk losing sight of long-term goals. Tesla, for example, can scale quickly, but sometimes at the cost of quality control and operational stability. So balancing adaptability with stability is crucial. And finally, dynamic capabilities may be ignoring organizational culture in the sense that dynamic capabilities assumes that firms can mobilize employees to change, but in rigid cultural corporate cultures, resistance to change is a major barrier. An example would be Intel's pivot in the 1980s. It worked because they actively changed their culture, not just their strategy. So Liena has given me the 10 minutes up, so I will stop here and hopefully we'll be able to continue our discussion. Thank you so much for the time, Liena.
Thank you very much, Tamer. I'd like to remind the audience, if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A sequence. And we will go to our next speaker, who is Jay Barney from the University of Utah. And Jay is joining us today from Utah. Jay is the chair professor of strategic management. He also holds a number of prestigious awards for his contribution to management research. He has over 200,000 citations, and he is widely regarded as one of the founders of the research-based view of the firm. Please welcome Jay Barney.
First of all, let me thank the organizers of this event. Appreciate it, all that you've done to put this together. I also want to thank David. I consider him a good friend and colleague, and it's a great opportunity to read his work in detail and to think about it and its implications. And that was certainly the case with this particular paper that I was asked to comment on. And I've also had joined with a couple of co-authors in our response. One is my co-authors is Ilse Kivsnes, who's at INSEAD, and then Anita McGann, who's at the University of Toronto. And David's paper does a fabulous job of identifying two theories of the firm. And there's lots of ways of characterizing these two theories, but I think I'm going to use the approach he talks about, which is that one theory of the firm, perhaps the more well-established theory of the firm, is the notion that firms are created to solve transactional problems that put the realization of economic value in exchange at risk. I call these loss avoidance theories of the firm. The idea is the value gained in exchange is taken as a given, not part of the theory. And the real problem is how do we make sure that you realize that both parties to that exchange realize that value as much as possible. And this leads to things like transaction cost economics with the problems of specific investment and opportunism, and et cetera. The second sort of class of theories of firms David focuses on capabilities and the ability of firms to facilitate the creation of value, not just how it's actually created, not just how it's allocated. And there are a variety of these. This is a less well-developed tradition in the field, and in both international business and strategy. But there are a variety of people who are trying to figure out how is it that we can think about firms in this way. And one of the central themes about in David's paper is the idea that these two theories need to be brought together as complements to develop a more complete integrated theory of the firm. We take a slightly different approach. We build on those two ideas, those two theories of the firm, but we take a slightly different approach because it strikes us that those two theories of the firm, both the loss avoidance theory and the value creation theory, actually predict very different kinds of firms. And here I do wish I had the slide because I have several bullet points I want to zip through very quickly. The paper explores this logic and explains why we come to these conclusions in some detail. But loss avoidance firms, these are firms that are predicted by transaction cost economics and related arguments. First of all, value is created by value creation is exogenous to governance choices in these theories. So Williamson is very clear in his work that he's not trying to explain where value comes from. He's trying to explain what's the most efficient way to realize and allocate that value. In this model, specific investments are a source of opportunism and thus need to be managed and controlled. This control is realized primarily through the application of managerial fiat, that is, managers in an organization making decisions for others, and controls and rules. Firm boundaries are defined by the existence of this managerial fiat. When managerial fiat exists in exchange, that's within the boundaries of the firm. Anything outside, anything where managerial fiat is not exercised is outside the firm. Exchanges within a firm are all managed roughly the same way, and owner shareholders' only interest is maximizing their wealth and investing in that organization. So we're talking about a fairly hierarchical organization where that focuses on minimizing the threat of opportunism through exercising managerial fiat and control. The paper then goes on to say value creation firms can look very different than that. value in this theory, value created by exchange is not treated as exogenous, but is in fact endogenous. It is part of the reason the firm is created is to facilitate the creation of value. Specific investments in the creation of the value creation story are not a source of threat to be managed and reduced, but in fact are the source of the economic value. That is, co-specialized resources and capabilities are in fact a potential source of value creation. That creates the possible threat of opportunism, but opportunism in the value creation firm is minimized. It's never eliminated. Neither theory has a theory of how to eliminate the threat of opportunism. But in the creation, in the value creation setting, the threat of opportunity is tempered by the value that you can create by continuing to cooperate. People remain involved in a firm and don't engage in opportunistic behavior because they can make more money in that setting than they can in the other setting, and that becomes a solution to the opportunism problem. Whereas the traditional transaction cost loss avoidance firms focus on have well-defined boundaries, as Tamer expressed, value creation firms boundaries are much less important. Indeed, one of the critical sources of value creation in these firms is human capital, and human capital can't be owned, and thus leaves every night, goes home every night, and there's a boundarylessness about that. Managerial fiat is really organized, really exercised in these organizations, especially among critical stakeholders whose co-specialized assets are essential to the creation of value. And some of those critical stakeholders may have interests besides simple wealth maximization. Now, those are, I would argue, two very different kinds of organizations. Now, we're not arguing that one organization is real and the other is not real, or that traditional theories of the firm that focus more on explaining hierarchy and control and managerial fiat and boundaries are not appropriate. There are lots of examples of firms where those are the critical issues. We are suggesting that traditional theory does not do a very good job at explaining firms where boundaries are less important, where opportunism is controlled primarily not through the exercise of managerial fiat, but the exercise through the creation of value and the creation that comes out of the organization. This suggests to us that what we have now, and what David actually has suggested in his paper, is we don't have a theory of the firm, we have theories of firms, both plural. Now, an important question, certainly Tamer spoke to this issue as well, is when are these different theories more or less likely to be relevant and explain how a particular firm, domestic or international, should be organized. And our hypothesis, and it's not a fully developed theory at this point, certainly, but our hypothesis is that loss avoidance firms will be more powerful tools for explaining the structure and operations of firms when value creation is not problematic. Remember, value creation is treated as exogenous in these theories. So if value creation is not problematic, then the real question is appropriation and distribution. That's the only question that's left. And these would be, as some of the things that Tamer noted, in highly regulated industries, or in industries where there's established firms have large market power and thus are already generating economic rents. But value creation firms, on the other hand, are more likely to emerge in settings where there's globally competitive markets, in entrepreneurial settings, and some of the other things that Tamer suggested. I'm almost out of time. Let me just make one final point. One of the other things we raise in the paper is the possibility that if within a single organization, both kinds of firms can exist in some sense. So both sets of governance mechanisms can exist. So, for example, just a really simple example, in many organizations, there are two HR systems. One of them is very much a control-oriented, transaction cost-oriented, and the other is HR, whatever it takes. We will do whatever it takes to get the right people. And the distinction usually is between HR for senior managers or senior engineers, senior technical people that are essential to the creation of economic value versus HR for the rest of us, the rest of the organization, where rules are much more important. And so managing tensions between those two parts of a single organization that are derived from different theories of the firm can be important. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jay, and thank you for the questions. So now our next speaker is David. So we're going to invite him to offer his reflections, drawing on his reflection piece that has just come out in JIBS Online. David is the chair in global business and the director of the Institute for Business Innovation at the University of California, Berkeley. He is an economist and an authority on matters of industrial organization, technological change, and innovation. He is a holder of multiple awards and honors, including 8 honorary doctorates. And to this community, he is best known as the intellectual force behind the dynamic capabilities view of the firm. David is joining us from sunny Florida today. So David, over to you.
Yes, thank you. I am in sunny Florida and also interacting with the faculty here at the University of South Florida. But I'm very happy to be interacting with you all today, and I really appreciate the comments from Jay and from Tamer, and I'll try and deal with them at the end of my little opening, but also along the way. Embedded in my paper is a quote from Frank Knight that I think goes to the heart of the points that both Tamer and Jay are making. Frank Knight wrote in the 1920s, and I think if he had been writing today, he would have won the Nobel Prize already, but I don't think the Nobel Prize in economics was around at the time that Frank Knight was around. Here is the quote: "With uncertainty present, doing things, the actual execution of activity becomes, in a real sense, a secondary part of life. The primary problem or function is deciding what to do and how to do it." Another way of putting that is that when there's deep uncertainty, efficiency considerations are secondary, and what's primary is figuring out what to do and how to do it. And that's dynamic capabilities. Or put in my language, when you have deep uncertainty, what I call ordinary capabilities don't matter as much. It's not to say they don't matter at all, but they don't matter as much. And of course, internalization theories and what Jay referred to as protecting value type theories fit into that category. But what does fit into the category of managing deep uncertainty is, of course, dynamic capabilities. So this brings, of course, a natural tension, because we're not saying that ordinary capabilities don't matter. We're saying they do matter, but when there's deep uncertainty, dynamic capabilities matter more. So we have an inherent tension always, because as Jay and Tamer pointed out, there are different types of organizational structures and managerial methods that fit behind and that support ordinary capabilities versus dynamic. So first of all, let me just back up for a moment to talk about these, what I now consider 3 classes of capabilities. There's dynamic capabilities, and Tamer explained what they were. But then there's ordinary capabilities and what I call superordinary capabilities. Ordinary capabilities are about efficiency. Of course, you'll immediately recognize that internalization theories and the like are about efficiency, and Jay added asset protection. Superordinary capabilities are getting really good at that stuff. You know, getting to best practice, and I'll even say beyond best practice. But best practice with respect to accomplishing a certain set of tasks, putting aside the question, are they the real set of tasks that you need to be performing in order to stay relevant in the market? So dynamic capabilities framework actually has embedded within it ordinary and superordinary capabilities. And all of these concepts are necessary to understand today's global business environment. So I think one thing I would state is that the dynamic capabilities framework is much more of a systems approach. It's actually not neglecting the efficiency story. It's not reading it out of the managerial book and saying, guys, you don't have to worry about efficiency. You don't have to worry about protecting what you've got. But if you want to be focused on creating value in this deep uncertainty, then you've got to have strong dynamic capabilities. And not all companies have strong dynamic capabilities. In fact, most don't. And don't think of dynamic capabilities as a unitary thing, a 1 or a 0. You can have strong dynamic capabilities, or you can have weak dynamic capabilities. And when companies get started, they start with strong, an initial insight and something that leads to a point of difference. But over time, dynamic capabilities tend to erode because companies get focused on the efficiency stuff, in part because we teach them that that's what's important, but because, and this is a different paper that I'm writing with Jay, also because of the way capital markets work and the way governance structures work. So my point here is that, I'm not, in emphasizing dynamic capabilities, I'm not reading out ordinary and superordinary capabilities. And in fact, in the paper that I published, my reflections, I looked at the story of Hyundai, and there's a sequence there where to become a great company, and today Hyundai is one of the top 2 or 3 companies in the U.S. auto market and also globally. But they didn't start there. They started with building ordinary capabilities and then on to building superordinary capabilities. And then once you get to the frontier, then that's where dynamic capabilities come into play. So the dynamic capabilities framework, I think, is big enough to accommodate notions of springboarding and leapfrogging. And there's, of course, big literatures in IB. Rosalie Tung, for instance, written important work on springboarding and the role that this plays for later stage entrance into the global marketplace. So I put forward to you that dynamic capabilities actually is a broad framework. And to be honest, I don't think there is another broad framework out there in the management literature that enables you to encompass or at least slot in all of these factors that we're talking about. So take the Hyundai story. They started off with very weak ordinary and one would argue almost no dynamic capabilities. And they started assembling kits that were provided by the Ford Motor Company. And the first car they built was a Ford Cortina. But it didn't take them long to figure out that they needed more. And they then got into a relationship with Mitsubishi in order to build engines and gearboxes and so forth that were distinctive. And it wasn't long before they actually started to have some superordinary capabilities. And there's a progressive story of spending on R&D and augmenting their basic capabilities until they get to the frontier. And then when you're at the frontier, it's dynamic capabilities which really come into play. And springboarding and leapfrogging are methods or strategies for catching up. But at the frontier, it's dynamic capabilities that come into play most violently, if I can use that term. So what are the implications of the capabilities framework? And in fact, rather than referring to it as a dynamic capabilities framework, perhaps it's best to refer to it as a capabilities framework. First of all, I think the dynamic capabilities framework helps us understand and be able to deal with the fact that unbounded globalization is a thing of the past. We're now in a world where, in fact, there's much greater uncertainty because the rules of global governance are being challenged, primarily by China and Xi Jinping. So we have deep uncertainty with respect to what the rules of global governance are. So not only do you have technological uncertainty coming from digital platforms and from innovation more generally, but you have geopolitical uncertainty. And then, of course, you have national security issues injected into everything. So, and this is not just true of the US, it's true in Asia and it's true in Europe. So our management theories have to be able to deal with this. And it seems to me that one way to summarize a lot of these new factors is to put them in the bucket of deep uncertainty. And as Frank Knight explained, that should be the primary focus. Now, let me just make a few remarks in response to things that Tamer said and that Jay said. Tamer, of course, is framed it in terms of how do you choose? And what I'm trying to argue is you don't have to choose in the dynamic capabilities framework because we have both dynamic and ordinary capabilities. And a lot of the basic issues that Tamer referred to fit under one form or another of ordinary capabilities. And the whole internalization theories of the firm really, in my mind, are about ordinary capabilities. They're about efficiency. It's about protecting what you've got rather than figuring out what it is you need to grow. And in fact, Tamer summarized my framework nicely by saying that, dynamic capabilities is about competitive advantage and figuring out how do firms thrive. Now, think about the way that Coase, which, Ronald Coase and Oliver Williamson thought about transactions cost and internalization. That was about understanding the existence of firms, nothing to do with the success of firms, just their mere existence. It wasn't about how they thrive. It wasn't about how they grow. It wasn't about how they create. So one thing that stimulated me from Tamer's comments is to actually make this point more explicit, that the economic theories of the firm, the ones that Jay sort of threw in one bucket, are really not about how firms thrive. They're about the mere existence of firms. Who cares about existence? One cares about prosperity, not mere existence. So that was an important insight that I think can carry us forward. And when referring to static industries, well, what's a static industry today? Can be dynamic tomorrow or can be disrupted tomorrow. And Tamer mentioned the steel industry. I'd say maybe in the steel industry in the 1960s was relatively stable, but it's definitely not stable today. And so I think you have to take into account that there may be periods, and if you accept the sort of Schumpeterian notion of punctuated equilibrium, there may be periods of relative calm. In fact, I think we lived through a 70-year period of history, which was a holiday from real history. And we created most of our theories of international business in this period of relative calm. So it's not surprising that as we return to the world that existed before 1940 or before 1939, that world was one of deep uncertainty, just as today's world is one of deep geopolitical uncertainty. So all of our theories that we're so proud of in international business were carved and created a very special time. When I say special, it was a 50 to 70-year expanse of history where the rules of global governance were coming into effect or came into effect in 1945, and economic development and sort of more or less followed in that groove, even if countries like Korea and Taiwan and Japan initially were not playing by the rules of international governance. They eventually did. And now China has come along and it's not. And if China was a small economy, it wouldn't matter. But because it's a very large economy, then you've got disruptive forces at work. Just circling back to a couple of Tamer's other comments, emphasizing organizational culture and how hard that is to change. That is exactly correct. And that's, of course, with dynamic capabilities, you have sensing, seizing, and transforming. And transformation is very hard, and it really does highlight the importance of organizational culture. And some firms are just not able to change. So even if they get the strategy right, if they get the culture wrong, it won't work. So let me just conclude with some final remarks with respect to Jay's comments. Jay points out quite correctly that it's hard to integrate these two clusters of theories. He refers to two theories, but I consider them more to be clusters of theories. And so the question is, if they're hard to integrate, what do we do? Well, we go back to what Frank Knight said, which is one has got to be primary and the other secondary. And what's got to be primary today in today's disruptive world is the dynamic capabilities or the ability to change and to figure out what to do next. So whether Jay is right to point out that you tend to have more hierarchical structures when you're looking at efficiency considerations and protecting what you got, and you tend to have more flexible structures and less hierarchy when creativity is the norm. Of course, the challenge of management is that even if one is primary and one is secondary, these things are still hard to do together. And of course, this brings us to the work of Charles O'Reilly and Mike Tushman on ambidexterity. Figuring out how to do this simultaneously is hard. But if you take Frank Knight's position, then let's focus more on the dynamic side rather than the static side, at least until we get back to a period of calm like existed in the world from 1945 maybe to 2010. So let me leave it there, but with one final comment, which is that with so much complexity and so many things to consider, one needs to focus on systems theory. And sadly, there's very little research in economics or in management on systems theory. The engineers still think systems, and you might find a course on systems theory in the engineering school. But I put forward to you that dynamic capabilities is a workable systems theory approach. And that's why I think it's relevant. It helps organize the literature. It helps show how things fit in. It helps tell you what is the most important things to worry about. And it's not a silver bullet solution that says this is what you do in order to succeed. In fact, I think what's special about the dynamic capabilities framework is that it tries to encapsulate many of the important streams of research in the social sciences that relate to business, and in particular, international business. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, David. So we just have a few minutes for questions. And the first question I'd like to ask is an interesting theory question from Jean-Francois Henart, who argues against the juxtaposition of the two goals of internalization. So one on the reduction of transaction costs versus value creation. So the idea is that the right governance structures enable efficient resource transfer and thus enable firms to maximize gains from these resources. So accepting that, wouldn't transaction cost reduction and value creation be one of the same? And I think this is perhaps a question for Jay.
Hi, John. Yeah, I think it is. And I think the answer is no. And the reason I say no is because not that is in principle possible to integrate any sets of ideas, but really, as David points out, the real critical thing is what are the implications of those ideas for managerial action and the way the organizations are created and formed. And the logical endpoint in a value creation world organization is something that economists and strategy and management scholars have had a hard time with, including myself, which is a stakeholder model. That is, we have to identify who the critical stakeholders are, who are essential to the creation of economic value, and then we have to find ways, and management has to find ways to engage those stakeholders in ways that's where they're willing to make specific investments in a firm. That model is of engaging, trying to solve the opportunism problem by creating more value together than we would be separately, is a very different set of implications than the hierarchical, control-oriented, exercise and manual fiat kind of model that has dominated traditional. Now, is it a traditional approach? Now, is it possible to modify traditional theories of the firm to make them more amenable to value creation? Probably the answer is yes, but at some point, you then lose what is the essential argument that Coase and more particularly Williamson and Alchin and Demsnitz and people like that were making in the first place. So I think the real trick is look at the implications of these two theories, and they do explain the existence of very different kinds of organizations. Again, I'm not arguing that one is right and one is wrong, because they can both kinds of organizations can exist in the economy, and even within a single organization, they can a single organization can mix both kinds of firms within those, but they nevertheless require, I think, really different logic.
Thank you, Jay. I'm sure we could discuss this for a while. I think in the interest of time. Oh, and sorry.
I said especially with Professor Hennard.
And thank you, Jean-Francois, for the question. Arthur Lee would like to bring up the microfoundations angle, and Tamer and Jay specifically referred to microfoundations in their remarks. So what Arthur would like to see is how can IB scholars better leverage in their research the microfoundations angle when studying dynamic capabilities. Would anybody who would like to answer it from the panel? Tamer?
Well, that sounds like a question for David, actually. I mean, this is the question that's been raised. I mean, how do we operationalize in research, in empirical research, these micro foundations? Yeah.
Well, the reference was made earlier to behavioral theories, and I think in trying to understand sensing and seizing, in particular, understanding, the actions of individuals, the motivations of individuals, and how, in fact, the leader and the top management team really cottons on to the changing environment and decides to act. I mean, I think there's plenty of room for micro foundations to be built underneath. And if you read my 2007 paper on explicating dynamic capabilities, there's quite a bit of reference to behavioral economics and behavioral decision theory as helping us understand why some firms sometimes fail to understand the changing business environment. That the Nokia story, the Kodak story, all of these things, to some extent, have important implications, or they're important sets of problems at the micro level that led to that, not just sort of macro level consideration. So I think they all slot in. None of this stuff is neat and tidy. But the world is not neat and tidy either, so one shouldn't expect our theories and frameworks to be neat and tidy. And if they are, beware of them.
Arthur maybe referred to a paper that Alan Verbeke published a couple of years ago in JIBS, where he gave some practical directions for operationalizing these micro foundations. So I think that that paper will be insightful, and we refer to that paper in our commentary.
Can I make a real quick observation too? It's really, really interesting how David and Tamer both raised the question of organizational culture and realizing the value associated with dynamic capabilities. And completely independently, I actually have done research on changing organizational culture for all those exact reasons and have a book out. It's called The Secret of Organizational Culture Change. But I think that that's the kind of a micro condition that is really important for us to understand.
Thank you very much. I think I have to wrap up the Q&A now and turn it over to Klaus. Thank you very much for the interesting questions. Apologies that not all of them got answered, but I hope that we can continue the conversation. And I will turn it over to Klaus now.
Thank you very much, everyone, for your contribution. I think there are a lot of starting points for conversations. For example, I would propose that Jay and Jean-Francois organize a panel for the next AIB conference, because I think the two of you have something to discuss that would be of relevance for scholars in our community. I think this is a special seminar, actually, also in a different ways. I think it's the first webinar I've done where there are no slides at all. I thank all the speakers for forcing us to concentrate on your words as opposed to taking the shortcuts of the PowerPoints, which usually they have advantages, but you know, in terms of really getting people to think, sometimes the word is much more powerful. I also thank you for raising new ideas of where the future research is, and thinking especially of the latter comments by David about new sources of uncertainty, whether it's in digital space or in the geopolitical change. Presumably, dynamic capabilities are highly relevant for explaining that, but there are obviously open questions on maybe the nature of dynamic capabilities may evolve. With that, again, let me thank everybody, and a few general remarks to end. Most of you know that the webinars are available online. Okay, here's the list of, by the way, the papers on this slide, it says advance online. I got the message yesterday. The papers, the reflections are available if someone wants to get them on JIBS. You can find older webinars on YouTube or on the AIB website. And this webinar will also be uploaded on YouTube and on the AIB website. It may be of interest. I've given the speakers what the speakers said today. I would assume you would want to recommend it to your PhD students. And with that, let me thank Rosalie and Ari, who are the editors of our journal, AIB office, and Digital Motion for supporting it. And this is my last seminar because I'm handing over to a new team as coordinator. Stephanie Wong and Carl Fay will be taking over the coordinator role going forward. So let me close by wishing them good luck in organizing, and I hope they will find seminars as exciting as today's.